Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by CalcBench, Sniffing Out Supply Chain Disruptions. My name is Matt Kelly, and I am your moderator for the webinar today. Thank you all for joining us. Our goal here today is to talk about how financial analysts and other consumers of financial data can make more sense of what corporations are saying these days about supply chain issues, whether that is anything from lack of raw materials to price inflation to challenges with worker development and talent shortages, the effect on operating margins or other financial disclosures, all of that. Clearly, supply chain issues are very much on the minds of corporate executives today, and there is a lot of data on that subject out there if you know where to look for it. So CalcBench decided to put this webinar together today to help people understand where they can find that information and how you can analyze it in a more effective way. We have several speakers with us today. In fact, we have the whole CalcBench gang with us. You can see them up on your screen. First, we have Pranav Ghai. He is the co-founder and CEO of CalcBench. And in fact, the company was founded 10 years ago this month. So Pranav, welcome.
Hi, Matt. Thank you.
Also with us, we have Alex Rapp. He is the Chief Technology Officer at CalcBench and the other co-founder of the company who was also there 10 years ago this month. Alex, hello to you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming.
Next, we have Ariel Markelevich. He is the Chief Product Development Officer at CalcBench and also a professor of accounting at Suffolk University in Boston. So Ariel, welcome.
Hi, everyone.
And Andrew Kittredge, he is a senior developer at CalcBench and a financial analyst with us as well. So Andrew, hello.
Hi, thank you.
So between the four of them, Pranav, Alex, Ariel, and Andrew, they're each going to try to take a slice of that very broad subject, supply chain disruption, and analyze it in various ways to give listeners a more holistic sense of how you could study all of this information and how CalcBench can help you dig it up and how to help you analyze all of it. This is the agenda that we have here. We're going to go for 1 hour. First, Pranav will offer some general observations about supply chain disruption, its effect on operating margins, cost of goods sold, other key financial disclosures like that. Next, Ariel will talk about where you can find information on supply chain issues in the earnings statement and the important role that narrative disclosures in the footnotes can also play to help an analyst find out and understand where all this information is and what it's telling us. Third, Alex will walk through a real-life example or two of which firms are benefiting from supply chain disruption, because some say they are benefiting, but also how you can study that data to determine how real these benefits are or are not. Then fourth, Andrew will offer an example of how to model supply chain issues and information and operating margins and whatnot. Show us how to do that in Python using the CalcBench API. And then at the end, we will save some time for questions. If you do have questions, you can ask them using the Q&A function anytime. If they are especially on point for what we're talking about, we'll drop them in throughout the whole hour. Otherwise, we'll save them up for the end. And then we have a short wrap-up video just to celebrate our 10 years here at CalcBench. So that's what we're looking to do. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, this webinar is being recorded and it will be archived later on online. Everybody who's listening, you are muted by default. Second or third, we do love questions. As I said, you can ask them using the Q&A function on your screen. If you have any other comments you want to try and pop into the chat or anything like that, the more conversational we can make this with listeners, the better. And then we'll try and reflect whatever's on your mind in the conversation we're having. And then finally, we, alas, do not have any continuing education credit offered for this webinar. But other than that, those are all the preliminaries. So now we can get started. And Pranav, you're going first, so take it away.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you to all the folks joining us today. It's been a privilege to be here for 10 years, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some background. So we'll just go to the next slide here. First, you can all hear me, yeah?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So we started the company in 2011 in sort of what I call the virtual garage. We aren't in the same physical locations, and as a pandemic goes, that's not such a bad thing. But one of the really neat things was that when we started the company, there was this thing that was just emerging called cloud computing. And it let us do something that was novel at the time. And that was when you have a data set that you know you're going to be maintaining and using, you need to be able to store it, and you need to be able to have backups and all of that other good stuff that you need. And so along came these companies, Microsoft being one, that offered a platform that let us access a database, a proper SQL database up in the cloud that we could retrieve data and store it, and then have our clients get access to it. And that simple thing meant that we could start a company from wherever we wanted. And so that's what we did. And so what do we do today? We take all of this data that you guys are about to see, and we render it out for you to use. And how does that work? So right there, what you see on the screen in front of you is an example of recent filings from yesterday, Monday, November 15th. It was a particularly busy filing day. So the reason for that is that it's 45 days from September 30th, and there just happens to be some kind of compliance issue deadline on that day. But we'll leave that aside for now. But to give you some statistics from yesterday, we got over 800 filings in, and we process them as we get them. So they come in and we process, it goes in the database, and then not immediately, but maybe a minute or two after the filing comes in, you as a client could get access to it. And for this data, that is virtually instant. So more than 800 filings came in. Most of those were split between the 10K, 10Q, almost 500 of those, and then almost 300 earnings reports came in yesterday. So we process those, give you access to them, etc. So if we just go to the next slide. Here's an example of something that came in yesterday, and Alex is going to take you through a real in-depth example with this particular company. But I just wanted to show you that, like, for this firm, yesterday was their they released their earnings prior to the market open. They released their 10K prior to the market open, and that's wonderful, actually. So these guys, hats off to the reporting company at Tyson Foods for doing this. They managed to do something that most companies don't do, and that is get all the data out there in one go so that all of us can use it. And it's non-trivial. So what you can see here, though, for our purposes today, is that their sales numbers, as you can see, increased. Their cost of sales also increased, and net income, SG&A, everything looks like it's trending in one direction. So next slide. What happens is we skipped a few. So we're actually on the, that's it, there we go. So you can take an example company and then look to make you can conjecture by saying, okay, maybe these trends are holding across multiple firms. And so that's what we chose to do next. So using our multi-company tools at CalcBench, you can ask yourself a question about how things are trending. And so that's what I did. So I knew this webinar was coming up, and I knew I had to do something to show you guys the power of the database and how you can do these things. And so on the 5th of November, I just said, okay, I'm stopping the clock, and I'm going to say whoever's in the database right now in the S&P 500, I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to give you some salient statistics about the companies that have reported for the third quarter of 2021 based on that day. They must also have had a filing a year ago so I could have something to compare it to. And so when I did that, I got 370 companies. Just as a point of comparison, I went back yesterday, I did the same exercise, and there were 458 of the S&P 500 companies that have reported so far. So we've increased it a little bit. And then, so once you get the data set, you've got the revenue, you've got the net income, you've those four data points right there. You just do a year over year, very simple sort of thing. If they reported, you get the number into the total, and then you just do a delta from period one to over the year ago period. You find that both revenue and net income increased substantially in that group of companies. Wow. So that's a significant achievement, right? So GAAP profitability was up 26% year over year in this group of 370 companies. Cost of goods sold, yeah, it's up 13%. But when profitability is up 26%, you kind of look and say, who the heck cares about, my costs going up when I'm making that much more money? And so that's the framework, right? So we're going to start with that. And so what we're going to tell you next is you should care. And so if we can go to the next slide, we're going to use the data. And so you need to look a little bit deeper than that surface level example. And we're going to examine some industries. So inside the database is also the idea or the concept of an SIC code, standard industrial classification. And so you can add that as a column to the data set and just filter by it. And then you can run a couple, in Excel language, using our Excel add-in, you get the data out. Then you can do a pivot table on top of it, or if you're using some other analytical tool, you could write some code, whatever you want, to stratify the data by the category. So if you do that and you filter by SIC codes, you get something, and voila, here it is. So on the next slide, you see what we found, and that is that when you look at gross margins, so that is across these sectors, you find that there were two sectors or two industries rather, that really were impacted. The first is the wonderfully named retail eating places under SIC code 5812. I refer to them as restaurants. So McDonald's, Chipotle, Yum Brands, Darden, etc. You see that the gross margins went down year over year, primarily because their input costs went up, right? It's even more drastic when you look at the electric services firms, and that is, in order to produce the electricity, these firms use a lot of raw material, things like oil and coal, etc. Those prices went way up. Their margins went down. So the point is that we are here to give you those tools, and you can do even more sophisticated analysis yourselves. This was just sort of a toy example. My colleagues are here today to give you some really terrific examples, and I'm happy to turn it over. Thank you for being with us, and you'll hear from me at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
All right. And now I believe, Ariel, we're going to hand it over to you so you can walk through some examples of how to study things in the footnotes or in the earnings releases. So what do you have for us?
So Pranav, thank you. Hi, everyone again. Pranav was talking about the numbers a little bit, and I want to change it a little bit and talk about the words. So what I want to focus on is the disclosures. So the tone of what companies are saying and what they're saying in words again, and not necessarily in numbers. So following the example that Pranav just had for SIC 5812, the restaurants again, what I did was I looked at the last 3 months and looked for the word inflation. And in it, meaning I get obviously all the results for the inflation. And let's start here with Del Taco restaurant. So in their earnings release, they're talking about sorry, I just moved away from it. So they talk about commodity inflation of about 2%, or the 5% for the fourth quarter, they talk about labor and related inflation of about 6%. You'll see that this theme of labor inflation shows up in other places. So this was the 8K or the earnings press release. Looking at the MD&A section, they're talking about something similar. Again, under the labor costs, they talk about continued wage inflation. Another restaurant that I want to mention here is Chipotle. Again, looking at their earnings press release, and in this case, they mention the impact of COVID-19 and inflationary staffing pressures. So again, the theme that I mentioned before around labor. Now, if you were interested in the numbers for inflation, so what I showed a second ago around the ranges, these ranges that the companies are offering around inflation, one thing you could do is that CalcBench has an earnings press release query, and in it, what I'm doing is I focus on Del Taco just for the example, a single company, and then I looked for a label that contains the text inflation, so different numbers related to inflation, and these are the results you get. And this is interesting in two levels. So one is obviously looking at the numbers. The other thing you would see here is that I didn't restrict it to any history. So they have mentioned it in the fourth quarter of 2018, then it only in essence appears in the beginning of 2021. Now, by the way, when you're looking at these numbers, if you wanted to know more about these, you can hover over and click on trace here. And in essence, you get the range like I showed you before. But you get the numbers, which you can obviously download and analyze, or just the hits of when companies are mentioning these numbers. But regarding a systematic view of this, Angelo later would show you a little bit more about on ways to extract this type of data. So we spoke about inflation. Moving a little bit to other examples. What I did here was staying with the same SIC code, so staying with 5812, the restaurants. What I want to do here is actually look at El Pollo Loco, and here I'm looking at their 8K, and they talk about the fact that the company, the restaurant industry, continues to work through the supply chain challenges. So obviously what I did here, I'm looking for the word supply and the word challenges within 10 words, trying to capture variations of exactly the supply chain challenges. But you can obviously customize this to whatever you want to look for. So El Pollo Loco again, looking at these supply chain challenges. Now, another example that we can look at is BJ's Restaurants. BJ's Restaurants are talking about challenges here, talking about supply chain shortages here, and in general, they're looking at the tone again, which I think is interesting. So the offensive mindset, focusing on top line growth while managing through the industry labor, inflation, and supply chain challenges triggered by the pandemic. So the link between COVID and the supply chain issues, and again, the focus on, or the link that we're actually discussing throughout the hour today, the link between the labor shortages and inflation. Now, one thing that I think is interesting is that you see a theme potentially coming up, but the theme is not necessarily uniform, in the sense that if we look at another company, BurgerFi, for anybody who's into burgers, they are actually discussing something different. They say that they did not experience any supply chain difficulties. Now, it's true that they the statement is as of September 30th. Now, by the way, this was filed 4 days ago, so it's not old in filing terms, but they have not experienced any material supply chain difficulties. And this is interesting because later when I transfer it to Alex, you'll see that the impact of this is not uniform throughout all industries and all companies. So I spent a couple of minutes talking about food, which most people like. But let's just move to another group of companies looking at a different SIC group. In this case, 4213, so trucking. Again, I was looking for the same thing still for the last 3 months, looking for supply and challenges within 10 words. And here, there are a couple of examples that we can look at. One that I liked was this PAM. Our driving associates deserve a lot of respect. So what I found interesting in this is that although they don't talk about the importance of labor specifically by talking about the driving associates, you can clearly get the idea that they care deeply about their driving associates, and maybe that's linked to labor shortages or labor issues that we found in other cases. Another example, Werner, similar. They have they're talking about unprecedented supply chain and labor challenges. Yet another example, JB Hunt. JB Hunt is talking about supply chain fluidity challenges. Now, JB Hunt is interesting because we see the words here, and I will conclude now and transfer it to Alex, and Alex is going to look at JB Hunt a little more closely, and we'll get maybe a different picture than the one we discussed until now. Alex.
Thanks, Ariel. Yeah, that was great. I'm going to take a look at JB Hunt. They're in the middle, clearly in the middle. We're talking about supply chain here. We might as well talk about the people that are moving this stuff around, the shipping and the trucking. JB Hunt's a very big trucking company. What does it mean to be in these unprecedented supply chain challenges as a company? Clearly these companies are under a lot of stress. Their labor forces are under stress, but what does that mean for their financials? That's what we're going to find out. And again, this is our 10th anniversary webinar, so it's fitting that I'm going to do a little spreading financials over time, because that, after all, was the whole purpose of what our company was founded for. The whole reason Pranav and I decided to start this thing was just an easier way to spread financials over time, and we're still at it 10 years later. But in this particular case, we're going to look at earnings press releases, which is becoming a new and bigger part of what we do. And for those who don't know, the earnings press release is the first snapshot that a company releases of their data for a particular quarter before the 10K or 10Q or anything comes in. And we're looking at the one for JB Hunt here. And it has, the important numbers that the company thinks tells their story for that period. And what we do is we take all of these numbers and we put them into our database, and you can pull them up and build a model. Sorry, Zoom is getting in the way, so I couldn't change tabs. So this is everything you just saw in this press release is now also here, extracted into this model builder that I've got. And we're going to quickly build a model. First, what we're looking at here is 2 periods. This is on the left here is the most recent one, and on the right is the last quarter over the summer. So let's add a few more. And we had a question from the audience. Patricia mentioned that looking just 1 year back might not be enough, since 1 year ago was a very unprecedented time also in perhaps the other direction. And she is, of course, 100% absolutely right about that. And yet I am just for the moment going to look 1 year back, because I don't want to burn everyone's time building a 2-year model that will just kind of bore all of you. But it'll give you that point of where we're going and how you could do it if you wanted to. So what I've just done is I've added all the periods back, so we have back to Q3 2020. And now I'm going to just pick a few metrics that I think sort of tell the story. We'll take a look at revenue. We'll take a look at some of the costs. Here's the total cost, operating income, and net earnings. This is all from the income statement. Here you have some data by segment, which is interesting, but we can skip over that for now because under it we have also more new data from segment that tells, I think, a better story. It's not the financial data, it's the miles and the hauls and the loads, the key performance indicators or KPIs. And I think we'll take a look at, for each segment, the number of loads and the revenue, because this really tells what's going on. And there's one more here, loads, revenue. And then as the final thing, just a little bit out of the balance sheet so we can see if there's anything interesting there. And then what we'll do is export this into Excel. And it should just look a lot easier, be a lot easier to look at now. I'm still going to take a little more cleaning up, get rid of the cumulative columns because we just don't really need them for our story, and it'll just make everything easier to look at. Also, before anyone gets confused, we've just changed directions. Previously, the most recent period was on the left. Now the oldest period is on the left here. So now we're going left to right. This is more like how you would see something when you're building a model. And here it is. Here's our data going from Q3 2020 on the left to Q3 2021 on the right. And I think what would be interesting is to see the changes over time. So we can add those in. We'll make a little percentage change column here. There it is. Just gonna extend that down. And then copy it across to the other, excuse me. So those are our quarter changes. And then this, we're going to make a little year, we'll call it year over year. It's really the year, quarter over previous year, quarter change, which will be this one, minus all the way over here. Oops, sorry, this one. This again has to be a percent. So what we're starting to see here, pretty obviously, is that despite all of their talk about stress and unprecedented times, it's actually a pretty good time to be in the trucking industry. 27% increase in revenues. Yes, the costs are also going up. Here's the total, some of the snapshot of the individual expenses. You're seeing fuel, look at fuel, it's skyrocketing 60%. All of their love for their drivers and their employees, that's actually the least growing cost of them all at only 20% increase. Now 20% is a lot, but they're paying 60% for fuel, so they're not, drivers are getting a little bit of a short shift actually. The operating income here up 56% and earnings up 59%. So what's interesting here is revenue up 27%, total costs up 25%. So almost as much as revenue, just a slight difference. And this is a story, when you have a low margin business like this, a slight difference in costs and revenue, and it can really make a huge difference in the bottom line. Your bottom line increased over 50% just because you were able to pass a little more onto the customer than your suppliers are squeezing onto you. So again, it's a good time to be in this business, apparently. Let's look at more of how that revenue is happening. I think this is an interesting part of the story. These are all the different segments, as I mentioned before. Now, the name of the segment didn't get exported, but it just so happens if we do want to see it, we can trace back to the source document and see which segment is which. taking a moment. But here, this top one is intermodal. I don't know exactly what these segments mean, but intermodal, dedicated, and so on. What we're seeing here is the number of loads, so the amount of work they're doing, the amount of stuff they're transporting, the number of loads. Well, for this first segment, it actually decreased. The next segment up about 10%, this one up a little bit, and the final one up about 12%. So all in all, the amount of work they're doing is up, but what's really going up is the prices. 24% increase in revenue per load, 7% increase revenue per truck per week, 48% for this segment revenue per load, 22%. So what's really driving the revenue increase is not the amount of more work that they're doing, it's just how much they're charging for it. So once again, their costs are going up, they're passing those costs on to their customers, and plus a little bit more, just a little more, and that's enough to really drive a big increase in profitability. Now, we should, as always, take a look for red flags at the balance sheet, what we like to call earnings quality. You know, sometimes things look good, but beneath the surface, they're not as good as they look. So we just want to double check. There's a lot of ways to do this in the footnotes and so forth. We're going to skip over most of it, but for fun, we'll take a look at accounts receivable. And you do see, yes, accounts receivable is going up pretty significantly and a little bit more than revenue as a whole. So that can be a bit of a warning sign. It means that they're passing a lot of costs on to the customers, but some of the customers maybe are feeling a little squeezed. They're delaying paying their bill. You know, they're aging their invoices a little bit, and you can see why that might happen. So all in all, that's the story with J.B. Hunt. And I want to take a quick look at one more company that is, I think, an even more interesting case because they are another company that's benefiting from this, but perhaps even more so. And this is Tyson Foods. So if we look at this one, by the way, just came in yesterday, as Pranav was talking about. So this is hot off the press. The word is in here somewhere. If you search for the word in right here, inflationary market conditions. So basically the story of this whole quarter is prices going up due to inflationary market conditions, meaning they feel like they have pricing power. They're not going to say that in those words, but basically they're raising prices because they can. And we're going to take a look at how they do that by looking at just one single table here, the segment results, and it happens to be also ready to go here. I'm going to quickly build a model, include the table, export it once again. And what's wonderful about this table is it includes the prices right in it, the average price change. And I'm going to delete, once again, delete some things that we really don't need. And then we'll see what's really going on with this company. Sorry, this will just take 1 second. I wanted to include the bottom table is the operating margin, so we can take a look at that also. And again, the data, the earliest data is on the left and the later data is on the right. So you can see we'll start from a year ago. 1 year ago, prices were more or less flat. They were actually down a little bit, which makes sense because we were in the throes of the pandemic and people weren't going out to eat. People weren't, spending a lot of money. The volumes were up somewhat, depending on how you look at it. The next quarter, you're starting to see things change. Volumes again are down, but prices are starting to be up year over year. The next quarter, this is where things start to really go. Prices are up. The next quarter, price is starting to go way up. Volume is going up as well. And now here, volume down again, but price is really starting to skyrocket. So interesting. Look at how it's getting parabolic almost for this company. And operating margin, this, like I said before, this company is benefiting from this clearly by feeling like they have pricing power. This is not a case where they seem to be squeezed by their suppliers as well. They don't seem to be, putting a lot of it back into their suppliers. They're just getting a pretty good increase in operating margin thanks to the increase in prices. So that's a quick look at Tyson Foods. And if anyone has any questions, please pass them on. We can address them later on. In the meantime, I'm going to pass it to Andrew, who's going to talk a bit about how you can get this data programmatically through an API.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Hold on. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So my coworkers have sort of shown you how to do this using our Excel add-in and our web pages, but there's a whole nother side to CalcBench, and that is using the CalcBench API to get all of this data at a grand scale and do analysis both for very big data sets and very quickly, things that would be impossible to do in Excel or reading things on the webpage. So I'm going to go through an example sort of in line with what we're talking about today. And I'm going to ask the question, can we do word counts of various phrases related to inflation and supply chain issues and see if they're correlated with the profit margin that companies are reporting? And my goal here isn't really to do very robust analysis, but show people how this is not super hard to get started with. You do not need, you don't need to be a software engineer to get started with the CalcBench API and the tools that I'm going to show you. Some knowledge of programming is going to be helpful, but for instance, we have an accounting professor who this semester is teaching basically the same stuff to his undergrad accounting students as part of a data analytics class. So he knows how to program, but his students don't, and I think they're still able to muddle through this. The software that I'm showing here is the stuff the industry uses, both Wall Street and accounting firms. This is Python, a library called Pandas, a Jupyter notebook. These are all things that researchers and quants are using. So if you learn this, if you teach your students this, it's going to be valuable for them down the road. So I'm going to show some Python code. If you don't know anything, this is going to sort of be Greek, but you'll just have to trust me that this is not super difficult. So we import some stuff. We're using some other libraries, some code other people have written. In general, the algorithm is to go and to get the contents of the management discussion and analysis from the CalcBench database through our API. The management discussion and analysis is not tagged in XBRL. We are doing an additional step to get to that section of the 10K out. So that's a step that you can skip if you want to restrict your analysis to certain sections of the 10K. We have a bunch of sections out of the document, so you can restrict. We have management discussion analysis. We have risk factors. So I'm focusing on management discussion analysis, but you can easily look at other sections of the document. So we use the API to go out and get the contents of the documents. And then we're doing word count analysis. So what this line does is it it splits the company up by word. You know, it splits the document into words and then counts those words. And then we're interested in these three terms that we've used throughout this presentation: inflation, supply, and inflationary. So we want to find the number of times that these three words appear in every document. This is if you were going to do this, this is not very robust. There's much better ways to do this. You would want to use a stemmer so that inflation and inflationary were the same term, and you'd want to find a lot more synonyms. But for our purposes here, this is sort of a simple way to do this. That's the text side of things. For the financial numbers, we want to get gross profit margin. We're going to use the standardized data API endpoint. You saw that earlier when Pranav showed you the standardized data. This is that same data. Just get, we got it for 500 companies here. Again, we're using the 500 companies in the S&P 500. But if you wanted to do this for 6,000 companies, it's not much more difficult. So here, this is the table of profit margin that we got. So this is sort of a spreadsheet, but it's in Python, so it's easy to do more complex operations on. We also get the SIC codes, which Pranav mentioned earlier. Our hypothesis is that companies that talk about inflation and supply chain, they will have lower profit margins. So our proxy for discussing inflation and supply chain is the number of times the term appears in the document divided by the total length of the document. So we do some operations to put them into a format that's easy to graph. And then, so in this chart, you can, we didn't come up with a very good looking trend, but you can see or see the correlation or the lack thereof of the inflation count in the document on the y-axis and the profit margin on the x-axis. So, maybe what we're seeing here is some of the trends that Alex and Ariel pulled out. Maybe they're specific to individual industries or individual companies, and this is not. You don't see this across the economy as a whole. So to look at the industry and the time, the change over time, we can graph the change by industry and time. So again, we're using these terms: inflation, supply, and inflationary. How often do they appear in the documents? We do some operations to make it easy to graph them. And then we plot the change in the occurrence of the phrases over time for these 5 industries: manufacturing. So starting in 2008, which is about when most calculation data sets start, and ending in 2000 and ending now. So again, whether there's a broad trend here, I don't know. But maybe, so for instance, wholesale trade, it does seem like there's an uptick. Mining, there might be an uptick. But the point, this isn't this, you can, this can be done. Getting started with a quantitative analysis is not super difficult. You can, we're here to help you if you want to add this to your class or your, what you're doing at your job. Using this data in a quantitative way is definitely doable. So I will hand it back to Matt.
All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. And we are going to take some questions now. Let me pull up our official question card here. Hold on one second. So we do have a couple of questions, and I will throw them out in no particular order. One person was just asking about searching keywords in various narrative things. Does CalcBench provide earnings call transcripts where people could start searching for inflationary or supply chain or other keywords like that? I don't know if Pranav or Ariel or one of the other of you have a quick answer to that, but earning call transcripts, what's the status of
The quick
that?
answer is no.
Okay.
We'd love to. We would love to, but the answer is no.
Somebody else asking, can they get alerts on new filings for the companies that they're preferring to follow? Pranav, you were talking a bit about how quickly the data comes into CalcBench, but then how quickly then can the data go from being in the CalcBench database to an email alert or something like that in a user's account?
The answer to that is yes. So
All right.
there's a flag when you create certain. There's basically a flag that you can have an alert emailed to you when a company files. You don't have to go to our recent filings page as I did to be told of that.
Another question that is about Python. So Andrew, I guess I will put this to you, but somebody asking, are there basic Python scripts available for download to get me started? What would you advise that person?
Yes, and I will paste the URL. We have I was showing you a Jupyter notebook. We have a collection of them on GitHub. I can paste the URL in the chat and you can look at them.
Pranav, do we have data on foreign private issuers or foreign companies listed on other exchanges, or any plans to sweep in other companies like that?
We do. Alex can take that one specifically. There's you want to take that one, Alex?
All right.
The question is on foreign filers. There's
Foreign filers.
there's a wave of new filers filing an XBRL in Europe that has just started over the past year. And in fact, it was delayed in part due to COVID, I believe. So companies are generally filing still on a voluntary basis. And then next year, we're going to see a whole new wave of filings coming in from European companies. And that will probably just be annual data to start, but it's going to be a pretty big pile of companies that aren't currently covered, in our universe. So that should be pretty exciting.
Okay. Somebody else has written in with the question, have you seen diversity in practice regarding how companies report shipping and handling costs? I've noted some are included in cost of goods sold, others are included in expenses. This could make gross margins look much better depending on the geography on the income statement. I don't know if somebody has a specific answer to that, although right away, I would just say our CalcBench columnist, Jason Voss, writes about this sort of thing quite often. And he just wrote a column about how to account for expenses and when to capitalize them, when you can't, and any funny shenanigans that companies might try that way. So right away, I would recommend reading Jason Voss's column on these sorts of things. But I don't know, Pranav.
Yeah, I would say the answer to this is obviously yes, but with the caveat that there are rules about how you're supposed to report shipping expenses, and you would hope that similar companies would be reporting them similarly. So if you're comparing like companies to each other, you would expect them to have those costs in the same place, whether it be under cost of goods sold or under other operating expenses. Now, of course, there's always going to be someone who tries to make me wrong, and you might have to make an adjustment. It's pretty common when you're making that kind of analysis to have to make a little bit of an adjustment and say, well, for this company, I'm going to have to add what they call cost of goods sold. I'm going to have to add back some shipping and handling costs to that because they didn't do it the way all the other companies did. But hopefully, in general, if you're benchmarking similar companies to each other, companies in the same industry to each other, they ought to have those expenses in the same place on the income statement. But if you're just comparing companies across the board, then yeah, absolutely, they could be in either place.
We have
Depending on what kind of industry it is and whether they consider that shipping cost to be part of the product or not.
there's one other thing I would add, and it's slightly tangential to the point, but I'm going to say it anyway, because hey, this is our party, right? So last week, XBRL US had a webinar, and one of our users, an accounting professor at the Tuck School at Dartmouth, Leslie Robinson, gave a really, really great presentation about how to use XBRL data that she sourced through us, about the Taxation and Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and how she went about collecting the data. And there were similar themes to that question in that data. So for example, she had to go to the tax footnote to get a lot of that data, but there was some of it in the segment note. And so she had to kind of do a lot of this sort of, juggling, but she was able to do it because we gave her access to the data. And it's hard, we know that, but these tools give you the ability to cut across those kinds of things if you can find the translation. So.
I want to sneak in one last question before we get to final wrap-up remarks here. This probably is for Alex. Somebody's just asking, can you give a little more walkthrough on where on the CalcBench website were you when you got to that modeling page before you exported the data to Excel? Walk people through again. How do they find that on the CalcBench site?
So you're going to have to contact me after you're going to have to contact us after the webinar. That's a brand new, as I said, the press release thing is something we've been working on for the past number of years now, but it's really accelerating over the past year or so. And this modeling tool is still in beta.
Okay.
So not everyone does have access to it, but we're happy to give it. We are happy to give it to people to try out, as long as they understand that what they're getting into. There can be some.
Fair enough.
Some bugs still in that.
And then Pranav, in the last couple of minutes here, I don't know if you have any more sort of farewell or celebratory remarks to make on the 10th anniversary. And I think we have a CalcBench video, CalcBench over time, if we want to play that too. But any closing remarks?
Sure, I'll just give a little concluding thing here. We just wanted to thank everybody for their support over this last 10 years. We produce a lot of content here at CalcBench. Some would say perhaps we produce too much content. I would disagree with that. We do a lot of stuff here, cover a lot of topics out of these financial statements. And what you see really is a labor of love from a lot of the people here. Everybody really enjoys like rolling up their sleeves and getting dirty in this stuff because we think we know that there's real value to it. And we really do appreciate everybody's support, particularly those who've been with us since the beginning. And there are those who know. You can see on the screen in front of you where we started and where we've gone. That was on the left-hand side there. That was our original logo, and this is where we ended up. So we want to thank you again for coming out and supporting us, and we will see you around.
All right, and we'll play this video to wrap up. Everybody who has joined us, thank you for being here, and we hope you stick around for the video, which we promise is very brief. But and then we look forward to everybody being back in the 20-year anniversary in 2031.
It all began in the late 80s when Pranav Gai and Alex Rapp met in college. During the 90s, they both worked for various prestigious firms. In 2008, the Great Recession hit and financial analysts across the country found themselves out of a job. Pranav and Alex were among them. The next couple of years had them thinking, what next? In a fortuitous New York City moment in 2011, Pranav ran into Campbell Pride, a friend and former Morgan Stanley colleague, at a coffee shop. Campbell shared what he was doing with XBRL US and invited Pranav and friends to play with the XBRL data. Later that week, Pranav and Alex come up with a website that makes the data usable. CalcBench is born. In October, over a beer, Pranav and Alex hold their first board meeting. In 2012, their first check is cut. XBRL US hosts a contest to discover the top open source analytical tools that can mine XBRL formatted corporate financial data from the SEC's EDGAR database. The contest awards $20,000 to the contestants submitting the most useful and user-friendly application conducting innovative analysis of public companies. Calcbench, shown here with its original logo, wins the contest. Calcbench is also a finalist in the Mouse Challenge Startup Accelerator and are invited to speak at the AICPA National Conference. By 2013, Calcbench is starting to build momentum and even gets a new logo. Calcbench raises money, adds its first new team member, Ariel Markelovich, and lands its first corporate and university clients. It creates the first ever text viewer to look at the individual chapters within the filings, a breakthrough product for the company. In 2014, big things are happening. Calcbench becomes sustainable and is a semi-finalist for the Partnership for NYC Accelerator. Calcbench hires Andrew Kittredge, a senior software engineer and financial analyst. It also lands new clients like Workiva, BDO, Deloitte, Yale, Strategis, and Oxygen Biotherapeutics. By 2015, Calcbench is focused on scaling. It wins an SEC contract from EDGAR. In 2016, Calcbench becomes the data provider for one of the largest asset management firms in the world. Over the last 5 years, Calcbench has become a leader in the industry. Pranav and Alex have joined numerous XBRL and data quality committees. Calcbench is seen as a foremost expert in financial data, with publications like the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Fortune, and MarketWatch coming to them for their data and insights. Calcbench has also become a go-to provider of data for academics and is integrated into Fortune 500, enforcement agencies, and top 10 auditing firms, providing financial data to deep researchers, quant shops, banks, and more. Calcbench is changing the workflow for organizations that rely on financial data. So what does the next 10 years hold? We hope that you'll stick around to find out.
There you go. That is all for the webinar. Thank you all very much for joining us.